Today, I'm with the first pick. So remember earlier this fall when we spent a lot of time on this podcast evaluating a lot of these college quarterbacks? Well, before we look ahead to the draft, going to look back here at some of the names, guys whose seasons didn't go quite as planned, not be declaring for the draft in the coming weeks. And in fact, some of them will be transferring for the 2025 season in the hopes of improving their draft stock. A year from now, call a little WTFP self-scouting before we turn our attention to the college football playoffs right around the corner here. I'm Ryan Wilson, and to help me unpack all of this, 247's national recruiting analyst, my guy, Cooper Petagna. Coop, I appreciate you, man. You're in the thick of it, and you take a little time out because Rick's out there trying to save the Jets this week. So we're upping our game, getting a little younger, better hair, better beard than me. How you doing?
Is that public knowledge that Rick's out there trying to save the Jets?
Oh, yeah, because he has to give a disclaimer once a week on the show that nothing he does outside of the office with the first pick affects anything he does or says here. Because last year he was with the Commanders, and it got to the point where we would do mock drafts, and folks on the Twitter machine would take Rick's mock draft and assume and try to read between the tea leaves. And they thought that the Commanders were going to take Drake May because Rick liked Drake a little bit better. You're a Louisiana guy. Cooler heads prevailed. I was a Jaden Daniels guy. Jaden Daniels is now in Washington. But enough about Rick. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. You said it. I'm in the thick of it. This transfer portal. I mean, I knew it was nuts. It just seems like every year the volume grows. I mean, the cool thing for me is my first year grading all these guys in the portal is you really kind of get to see, all right, where have you, in terms of your high school evaluations, where have you gone right? And maybe where have you gone wrong? You know, there are a couple guys that I was grading that we had top 100 2 years ago from Georgia, Troy Bowles and Samuel Mpemba. And not to take anything away from them. I mean, they're still young in their career. It's fascinating just to kind of see, like, all right, how are these guys growing? How are they developing? You know, what does the environment look like that is, you know, benefiting them, or maybe it's not the right situation. So those are all things that I think over the last couple of weeks, honestly, I don't think there'll be a more beneficial exercise for me as an evaluator than, you know, what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks and what I'll continue to do over the next, you know, month and a half with the transfer portal. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because your background is you've been in football almost your entire life. You've worked at several stops. I want to talk about that in a little bit as we talk about old Billy Belichick and his not return. I think he was in Chapel Hill in 1950 with his dad when he was a wee lad, but he's back in college football, which is a strange turn of events. So I'm going to get your thoughts on that later. But you talked about the portal and the transfer news, and behind you there in the monitor, the 105, you do that with Andrew Ivins twice a week. So if that's your jam, if you like portal stuff, college football, transfer, please check that out and get that wherever you get your podcast. You guys are on CBS Sports Network once a week, and then I think just the regular podcast machine. Otherwise, saw you and Bud Elliott chopping it up, as Debo likes to say yesterday. I'm going to ask you about some of the things you guys talked about. But first, this is episode 207 somehow. Before we get going here, Rick's not here, so I'll save you the trouble here. 128 days to the draft, in case you're keeping notes there. That's for Rick. He likes to have all the information in front of him. But I think he has his hands tied doing other things here, I did see John Robinson was going to be interviewed. I saw Tom Pelissero of the NFL Network put that out, so that wasn't from Rick. So former Titans GM, I actually did a hit with him last week. I think he didn't seem he didn't seem super pumped to be with me. Perhaps he's looking ahead to getting back to in the front office, and I understand it. Thankfully, you're pretty pumped to be with me. At least you act like it. All right, before we get to some of these transfer portal quarterbacks that I want to talk to you about, Coop, because we talked these guys to death over the summer, early in September and October, because, you know, you're looking for guys that are going to be the next Jaden Daniels or Joe Burrow. We didn't have that in this class. There are two quarterbacks that didn't go in the first round, and if a third goes, it'll be a huge surprise. But I'm going to start here. I'll throw you a little curveball, but you guys talked about him yesterday, you and Bud Elliott on the 105. Debo's producing. Debo's a Drew Aller guy through and through. Drew Aller said he's coming back to school, which I think is the right decision for him. I just want to get your thoughts on this as someone who's spent a good part of their life in college football and understands what it means to have your big-time quarterback come back. And here's Debo's point. They could potentially play 3 more games, Penn State. What if Drew Aller balls out even though in my mind I think he should come back. Is there any regret? Do you think? Like, should he have decided to come back? I guess is what I'm asking you, because he has the chance to, and we see it all the time when these quarterbacks have great games on the biggest stages. That's all we talk about as we get through the draft. So, what are your thoughts on Drew Aller? And then, of course, more importantly, Bo Prabula leaving, because Debo was pretty bummed about that as well.
Well, I wonder if they're tied to each other. If like Drew Aller had it his way, would he have done it this soon? It maybe Bo
Ah,
Prabula leaving, maybe kind of forced his hand a little bit to come out and publicly declare that he's coming back for another year. I mean, it's a good point. I think from Drew Aller's standpoint, if I was in his corner, I thought he was coming off of one of his best games of his career, just watching that game live against Oregon, just in terms of some of the things that he was doing on the field, the intuition that he was playing with, the confidence, conviction that he was playing with as well. He seemed to elevate his team. And I think when you watch Drew Aller, he's always been more of a complimentary kind of window dressing type of piece with all the physical tools and traits that you've wanted to see emerge. That game versus Oregon, I individually saw some things from him that maybe I haven't seen in the past. So
and Coop,
it's
let me interrupt you,
interesting.
because you were on earlier in the fall with me and Rick, and I'm a little higher on Drew Aller than Rick is, but I think you and Rick agreed at the time that it looked like he wasn't a complete package yet. So it wasn't like you came into this thing with Penn State colored glasses on. You were of the opinion that Drew Aller had some room for growth, and it sounds like you saw that in that Oregon game.
I thought he was more day two, right?
Okay.
But to your point, in this quarterback class where it's Cam Ward, Shador Sanders, Garrett Nussmeier is coming back for another year. We'll see what happens with Jalen Milroe and Quinn Ewers. It's a pretty open quarterback race. And then you have Drew Aller right there from a physical trait standpoint that has everything that you desire. We had this guy ranked the number one quarterback in 2022 at 24/7 Sports. So it's been pretty neat to kind of see him play in to that physical ceiling that we knew he was capable of. But to go back to your original question, if he can turn in, let's call it consecutive performances, let's say they get by SMU and they get into the next round of the playoffs and he's playing at a high level, Drew Aller, I think that decision becomes a lot more difficult. And for him, I would say at this point, I'm totally on board with him coming back for another year because I think it makes sense. But if you see a guy that takes advantage of an opportunity at a high level over the next couple of weeks, I think that decision becomes a lot more difficult of a decision for him to make because this year, I think you have an opportunity for Drew Aller. I mean, we always talk about who's that guy, who's that Jaden Daniels type of prospect coming into the season, who's a day three guy. All of a sudden works themselves into a top 10 pick. Well, this would be materializing right in front of our eyes in the last couple
Yeah.
of weeks of the season. Drew Aller is one of those guys that's going to be really, really easy for NFL evaluators to talk themselves into, and I think it's going to be something to watch here over the next couple of weeks.
So just so for my own purposes, because I don't know, even though he said he's coming back, he can change his mind in the next few weeks.
I believe so. I think we'll need a fact check on that, but
Okay.
from
I
what I
think
understand, I
Debo's
do believe there is a deadline. So yeah, I'm not 100% on that, but I believe he could change his mind theoretically.
okay. Debo will get on that because he's has a vested interest as a Penn State guy. And you talked to Bud Elliott about this yesterday, Cover 3, and Bud's great on the 105. Bo Prabula is leaving. He's not going to be in the bowl game. He does some of the package plays. Drew Aller's a good athlete, but he is more of to borrow my phrase, a Justin Fields type that they bring in for a few plays to run around. Does that hurt or help? I mean, Debo likes the idea of just having Drew Aller be on the field the whole time, but obviously they use Bo a lot, so it feels like it could potentially hurt their offense.
Bo's a good player. I think just in fact, from a wrinkle standpoint, maybe giving opposing defenses like SMU something else that they have to chew on for Andy Kotelnicki, whether it's eye candy, what they're able to do with Bo Prabula's legs. I think the other thing that really kind of stood out about Bo Prabula is the way that he played against Wisconsin when Drew Aller was banged up. And, he came in and he was efficient. You look at that game, I don't think Bo Prabula is one of these high high ceiling type of players, but just in terms of the floor, toughness, dependability,
Right.
a guy that you can win with, he's an ideal number 2 in an insurance policy that
Mm.
you'd love to have in the CFP.
I love that Debo had his 247 player card ready to go for the graphic. Debo was all in on this SMU game. By the way, Debo will be in Happy Valley for that SMU game.
Love that.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, let's let's talk about this a guy that we talked to death over the summer and only played a handful of games in 2023 because of a foot injury. But the Miami game sticks out to me. Connor Weigman made some noise in that Miami game 2 seasons ago now. Started the season, Notre Dame was the first game of the year against Riley Leonard. And okay, we're like, all right, there's some cracks in the dam here. Let's get this sorted. And it never got sorted, got banged up. And then when he returned, he played well and then got benched. And that was a wrap. He's now on his way to Houston. And again, I think this is the best situation for him in terms of coming back and going to school and getting a chance to play. Did we get anything wrong with Connor Weigman, or is it just the fact that he has yet to meet expectations?
With regard to the high school ranking, I would say yes. And the biggest reason I'd point to that is the physical traits. I think the arm talent is adequate at best. There's some throws that you watch against Missouri that really kind of stick out. Deep third shots that he's trying to take that he kind of struggles with. Now, in terms of Connor Weigman at his best, I think it's processing power. I think it's playing the game proactively, the ability to play with anticipation, throw receivers open. But if you're turning the ball over and then on top of that, you're struggling with durability to stay on the field, it's going to be tough for Connor Weigman, I think, to make a case for NFL evaluators that he's a starting caliber quarterback in the NFL. And that's been the biggest, I think, hang up with him. Now, what I will say, his defense, you look at Texas A&M from a talent standpoint or receiver, I thought they were just okay, right? You look at Weigman from a play caller standpoint, he's had 2 play callers in 2 years, so he hadn't had a lot of continuity. Was he the best fit for Colin Klein? It seemed like Marcel Reed was a lot more natural of a fit in that offense. Obviously, once we saw him get the ball against LSU a little later in the season. And, Weigman, right, wrong, or indifferent, the guy that he kind of reminds me of now in the Houston fit kind of made me think of this is Michael Pratt at Tulane, because Michael Pratt's offense coordinator was Slade Nagel. Slade Nagel came over from LSU, is now going to be the OC at Houston.
Oh,
and
nice.
Those guys kind of remind me a little bit of each other. And now, obviously, I think Weigman's probably got a little bit of a higher ceiling there. But with regards to, what is the ceiling for Connor Weigman, at least where I see him right now, and things change quickly, like it happened with Drew Aller, right? But I think he's I kind of see him more as a day 3 quality backup role,
Which is crazy because I watched him over the summer, and me and Rick and Mike Renner talked about him in summer scouting. And I put, like I said, all right, 4th round on potential. And Rick and Mike tried to talk themselves into potentially being a first rounder. And that's what you do in the summer. You try to figure out who's going to be the guy. And it just never materialized. And Rick, as we went through the process, said, yeah, it would be hard to draft him right now the way he's playing. And I'm sure a lot of his confidence, because as you point, he's a former baseball player. He doesn't have Drew Aller's arm, but I mean, we've seen him make throws. Let me ask you this, because Donovan Smith was at Houston last year, another guy we watched over the summer and early in the season, and that did not work out. Is Houston? I mean, you talked a little bit about the fit with Nagel being the OC there. How do I want to phrase this? Do you often find that quarterbacks, once they transfer, are able to elevate their stock if they're sort of in the NFL draft conversation, or is it hit or miss, depends on situation type thing?
I think it depends on the situation. I think for Weigman, it is, he's going closer to home. The pressure of playing in the SEC at a high level is gone. And, we've seen some of these guys. It's going to be interesting, like Jackson Arnold. He's going from Oklahoma to Auburn. I was talking with some guys from around the Senior Bowl about this. I mean, if you're one of these quarterbacks, I mean, you look at Sam Leavitt. He leaves Michigan State. He's originally from Oregon. He goes to Arizona State. And you see the freedom that he's able to play with in Kenny Dillingham's offense. Just
Yep.
get away from it. Bo Nix goes out to Eugene in Oregon. Look what he's been able to do for his draft stock. And sure, those are one-off guys that I'm talking about here. But the SEC is a pressure cooker. And now Connor Weigman gets a fresh start going to a program that's in a second year of a long rebuild under Willie Fritz. And they've been doing a pretty sneaky good job in the transfer portal. And, the Big 12 is wide open. I mean, this could be a team that can surprise some people, and I think Weigman can be a big part of that. And a lot of that is, I think this guy can completely retool his image. Now, is it going to be going from, what we considered a day 3 or a priority free agent to a day 1 guy? Probably not. But if he plays well, I mean, we're probably talking round 4, right? I mean, that would be kind of what I think about him.
Yeah. And probably
So
north of that because there's such a premium on those guys,
for sure.
especially given last year. And I get some of it was media driven in terms of that he might be a first round pick. But if he comes out the first month of the season next year balling, it's going to be, assuming everyone, Garrett returns and Aller returns, the conversation is going to be Garrett, Nussmeier, Drew Aller, and here comes Connor. Is Connor Weigman going to be that guy? That's going to be one of those conversations for sure. So that's a great point about going. It's not necessarily a bad thing to go to a conference that isn't quite as competitive as the SEC and allow yourself to. And you and Bud talked about this with Bo Prabula. Sometimes you go to a not as glamorous a situation, for lack of a better phrase, to allow your what you do well to shine more on that stage that you find yourself.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just, got to find reps, right? I mean, there's a backup quarterback that we like, Walker White from Auburn. He was a really talented kid. He's a true freshman this year. Reminded me a lot of Will Levis coming out. And it's like you look at the situations right now. It's like, is there any place that would take him and say, okay, we're going to give you the keys without bringing in some competition at the Power 4 level? Probably not. I mean, this guy's probably going to have to go down a level, prove that he can do it, and then enter the free market again as he's seen as a guy that, can start at the Power 4 level. So, yeah, it's fascinating to kind of see these quarterbacks and their path in terms of what they choose to take to get back to where they think they should be ultimately at the end of the day.
All right. Well, that brings me to another guy that I knew nothing about until I watched the first game of the season and was totally blown away because I was watching our guy, Garrett Nussmeier, dueling it out with Miller Moss at USC. USC won that game, I believe, at the end, but both those guys were just slinging it. And he got benched halfway through the season. I watched probably 3 or 4 games through the midway point up until around the Michigan game. And then I was surprised to learn that he was finding his way to the bench. I know USC had struggled, but now he's in the portal. Well, he's out of the portal. He's heading to Louisville. I don't know if that's necessarily a step down. It's a step east. But does this feel like a situation where Miller will have a chance? Because he's set forever at USC, and now he's going to go sort of be the next guy up at Louisville.
I mean, similar to what I was saying about Weigman and finding a new spot where you can just kind of let your game breathe and develop. Miller Moss goes from Lincoln Riley to Jeff Brom at Louisville. And you look at what Jeff Brom has done, it's pretty funny. I might be the only one just kind of thinking about it this way, but he's taken these kind of like day 3 PFA guys over the last 2 years that are high floor players. And you think about Tyler Shuck this year, be interesting to see where he goes.
He's getting some buzz. Some buzz.
Jack Plummer, right? And Miller Moss, you turn on the tape, like from crazy to say, but from a trait standpoint, like a physical trait standpoint, he's got a stronger arm than Weigman. He's not a statue in the pocket. Obviously, he's not a guy that you have to respect from a mobility standpoint. But, man, he does some good things. And, I think the other thing is, like, we give so much grace to Garrett Nussmeier because it's his first full year starting.
We really do.
Miller Moss's first full year starting as well.
That's a great point.
Right? So you put Miller Moss in that situation with a guy that used to play the quarterback at a high level. It's got an eye for these type of guys, which guys fit his system. This is maybe one of my favorite fits of the quarterback cycle. And I like Miller Moss there in Louisville, and they're just going to plug him in. They're going to continue to do what they do, and they'll probably be right up there for 9 or 10 wins again.
And it feels like just not having watched Louisville football closely, but just from the perspective of the draft, it feels like Miller Moss is an upgrade initially in terms of the first year for Jack Plummer and the first year for Tyler Shuck in terms of what you're getting from the quarterback position, because you've seen it at a pretty high level. I don't have any knowledge of why he was benched or the reasons around it in terms of lack of play, or if he was or struggling or whatever. But from what I saw, there's a lot to like with Miller Moss. I do wonder how tall he is, but that's not an issue for Louisville. That's an issue for once he gets out of school.
Yeah, the things that I look at Miller Moss on tape, I mean, you know, they're all coachable. They're all things that can be fixed. I mean, honestly, there was accuracy at times. There was decision making in terms late game, critical decisions. I felt like the internal clock got sped up. They were all situational things, if that makes sense. They weren't things that were, all right, here's this pattern that's so toxic that, this is going to continue to fail this guy down the line. It's like, actually, I think if this guy finds the right home, he's got another year, he gets his feet under him, the game starts to slow down. You can really get on board with Miller Moss, and I love the fit. And the other part about it is when they made the switch, I think they just needed it was that point in the season, they needed a change. They had a guy in Jaden Maeva who was a toolsy kid, and I think they knew that Miller Moss was not going to be the guy next year. So they said, you know what, let's give this guy 2 to 3 game audition in Maeva. And by that time, we're going to have to go see if we need another portal quarterback. So it looks like at this point, USC is going to stay pat with Maeva and then a young quarterback in Hassan Longstreet that they're bringing in. So I think that's all it was. I was still relatively impressed with Miller Moss, some late game breakdowns versus Washington and Penn State and believe Michigan as well, but all stuff that I think can get corrected.
And the thing is, and you make an important point, and one that's important to remember, because I was, if not driving the Nuss bus, that may have been you. I was certainly sitting shotgun. So it is, I mean, and down the stretch, the second half of the season, Nussmeier made a lot of throws that I'm sure he wishes he had back. But I think your point about all the grace we gave Nuss, it's important to remember that all these kids are sort of trying to find their way, and they all have flaws, and you don't have to crush them just because they throw an interception. I don't think Preston Stone has decided yet where he's going, but he's leaving, right? SMU. And we talked about Preston Stone in week 1 or 2, whenever they played Nevada early in the season. And he was coming off the leg injury. He was going to split time with Jennings by design. And then eventually his snaps got fewer and fewer. And then he found his way to the bench. He felt like a day 3 guy that perhaps could be a Jake Kaner type or one of those guys. And now obviously he's got to go back to school and he's got to figure out where he's going to go. What do you think makes the most sense for Preston in terms of trying to get the most out of his ability with one more year to go?
I don't know. I've talked to some Power 4 teams that like lower level Power 4 teams that really like him. I mean, I think the thing about him, he's 13-3 as a starter. Then had that injury in 23, tried to bounce back. First passing attempt this year against Nevada, he threw a pick. But this guy's a gamer. I mean, ultimately, I don't know the NFL upside. I think when you, me, and Rick talked about him the first time around, I think Rick was pretty bullish on the fact that he was kind of a lower level PFA. And the more I watch him, that's kind of where I end up. But that being said, he's one of those guys that is going to have a greater impact collegiately than he'll ever have on Sundays, right? I think the NFL potential is capped, but in terms of what he can do with his ability to improv, play within structure, out of structure as well, he's one of those guys that he's just kind of scrappy, high floor, poised. I like the way he plays, a little bit of wild card at time. But this is a kid that I think can help a team win, but the fit is important, right? Schematically, it has to marry up with what they were doing. And I thought it was a good fit at SMU, and then Kevin Jennings, just a better version of him, kind of came along, right? So, I think he can help a team win. Kind of eager to see where he lands and what's that going to look like.
Just in general, is there a feeling of are some of these players who aren't 5 stars in terms of being in the portal for lack of a better phrase, since I don't understand really the nuances of the portal, but someone that's say like a Preston Stone who's not going to be the first guy to hear his name called, but the game of musical chairs, is there an urgency to find a team, or do you end up settling for maybe a team that you don't think or that's below where you should be playing?
I mean, think about Bo Prabula, right? And you think about Prabula and how all his teammates talk about him. I mean,
Hmm.
you hear how James Franklin talks about him, and ultimately, he's a casualty of the calendar. I think in a perfect world, he would have loved to stay there, But to your point, bringing it back to Preston Stone, yeah, there is an urgency. Bo Prabula probably wants to play power four football,
Yep.
right? And you've heard teams like, Tulane are making an effort to sign him, and obviously that's an appealing spot with what they've been able to do. But if it was up to Bo Prabula, he probably wants to play at the highest level. So yeah, guys like Preston Stone, I think they're eager to find a home where they know they can go in, compete, play at the highest level. If not, Stone's going to be back in the group of five, like he was just a year ago with SMU before they made that transition to the Power Four. So yeah, absolutely. And to the team side of it, you know, it's interesting. You look at Auburn and it's like, all right, we got to go. And it's Malik Murphy or Jackson Arnold. And a few days later, there's John Mateer, right? Um, and who knows? Maybe they knew their chances were handicapped a bit, but um, that's the thing about the portal. I mean, there's in your head, you're like, yeah, okay, best available player.
Hmm.
A couple of days later, there comes another guy, and you just chewed up a lot of your cap space, invested in somebody else where there was probably somebody else on the market that you would have preferred to go after.
Yeah, Debo's on fire working the graphics today.
I
So I
love it.
didn't. I just acted like I knew who John Mateer was, but thank you, Debo, for putting up the graphic. He's leaving Washington State. Where will he end up? And also, it just college football is wild, wild west now, in just terms of all the things that you're having to concern yourself with that you perhaps didn't have to concern yourself with 5, 10 years ago. You mentioned Malik Murphy; he's leaving Duke, and that brings me to this young man. Tulane's quarterback Darian Mensah. I had not watched him because he's not draft eligible, but I was reading up on him because he's now going to replace Malik Murphy at Duke. Had a good season at Tulane, and there's scouts that have their eye on Mensah a couple of years down the road. So I watched a little bit of him this morning. He's fun. He appears to be a little bit more accurate than Malik Murphy, so take that for what it's worth. But I'm trying to do the math. Is he that much of an upgrade over Malik Murphy in terms of what he brings at the position in terms of athleticism, arm strength, all those other things, other than being a little bit younger?
Yes, but not so decisively that I think it was kind of not an oddball move. I understand why you would do it. Duke went 9-3, and they pushed out their starting quarterback, who is a guy that's very toolsy, right? Like I would compare to like Joe Milton in terms of the stature, the arm,
And
the
just to
type
be
of
clear,
throws
Malik
that he
came
can
from
make.
Texas to Duke, and now he's in the portal, correct?
Correct. Probably going to
Yeah.
end up at Kentucky.
Okay.
So Malik, when you turn on the tape, and obviously Duke was a very complimentary team. They had a very strong defensive unit under Manny Diaz. Um, Malik was one of those guys. It's like you keep coming back. It's like I just one in every four throws you see it. It's kind
Yep.
of like the Jacob Eason, Joe Milton deal. You can talk yourself into it, but ultimately at the end of the day, like if I need a guy today, I don't know if I'm going with Malik Murphy. Now, here's the thing on Mensah. I grew up a couple blocks away from Tulane, so I watch a lot of Tulane football. And Mensah was a guy early in the season, and this guy came out of nowhere. They had two
Hmm.
guys that they liked. They brought in Ty Thompson from Oregon. They had another kid in Kai Horton who they liked. Both those guys are in the portal. Darian Mensah had two offers coming out, and he was out of California. And one was Idaho and one was Tulane. Tulane came in and was able to sign him late. John Summerall gets there from Troy. And I remember in fall practice, they're asking about the quarterbacks. Is it going to be Thompson? Is it going to be Horton? He's like, I'm just telling you right now, Darian Mensah just keeps doing things where it might be impossible for us to keep him off the field. Redshirt freshman, you watch the games versus Kansas State and you watch the games versus Oklahoma. Oklahoma was a little bit up and down, and you're like, okay. And I'm watching this kid, and you see the suddenness in the pocket. You see the way that he can move. You see the way that he can extend plays with his feet. He's got some playmaking ability. Thing I really liked about him was, I always talk about this with quarterbacks, the guys that know their limitations and play within them, those guys are really hard to find. And that was kind of Mensah. He kind of knew who he was, but he played within it. super decisive, quick processor, accurate, balls out on time, all those things we talk about that are so important. And then you watch the last couple games of the season, and it was like the script was flipped. And I had this guy graded early because I had heard that he was going to jump in the portal, and I had like a 5th round grade on him. And then I watched the last couple games. I watched the Army game, I watched the Memphis game, and I was like, whew, this doesn't seem like the same player that I watched early in the season. Careless with the football. It was a lot of Caleb Williams hero ball. And it's like all the things that were so desirable about him earlier in the season, he had developed some bad habits. So it depends what version you're going to get. And the other part you can attribute to is, he's a redshirt freshman, right? I mean, took his team to the American Athletic Championship. He went on the road at Army, got spanked. I thought the field vision regressed throughout the year. If you can get Darian Mensah, who you had in the first half of the season, if you're Duke, Darian Mensah from the first half of the season at Tulane, if you can get that version, you're going to upgrade. If you get the guy that we saw the last couple games, it's probably a wash, and that's kind of the way I see it. But this is reported 7-figure deal for this kid.
Okay,
and I think a lot of people were like, why'd he sign with Duke so early, and why was this done so early? I mean, and then you hear the number, and you're like, okay, I get it.
Right.
So,
because that was my question. Like, why does it make sense for him to leave Tulane? Well, okay, yeah, I see. If you show me the check, okay, it makes sense. You can go play wherever. Coast Guard Academy, if they're going to give you 7 figures,
for sure. I just hope he cleans it up. I mean, I think a little bit of it, maybe if I'm reading between the lines, is you start smelling your own stuff. Everybody keeps telling you how great you are, and then your play style changes. It's like, hey, man, we liked you because you're a high-level game manager that took care of the football, kept us on schedule, kept us ahead of the sticks. This other stuff, I don't know. So we'll see. I think he's totally fascinating.
And it's interesting when you were explaining the last few games for him, because the game I watched was in the middle of the season. He was just slinging it. He's not afraid to throw the ball over the middle of the field and not afraid to throw over accurately. And that's one of the knocks, sort of made up or otherwise, that we come up with these quarterbacks. Well, he doesn't throw in the middle of the field enough, whatever. But as you were talking, I was thinking it's like when the older you get, if you play golf and the more you're in your head when you struggle with putting because you're just thinking the whole time, and then you see like a 6-year-old putt just draining 30-footers all day because he's out there, he or she not giving a crap, and that's sort of how you have to play. And it feels like Mensah maybe turned into the old man putter down the stretch, and he was just a lot of things going through his head that perhaps he didn't have going through the first half of the season.
Yeah, I say it all the time. Like, more Clark Kent, less Superman. Put the cape away. Right?
Love it.
Just kind of know who you are. So if he can get back to that, they'll be fine.
All right, I love it. I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to come back here and talk about a couple of these non-QBs in the transfer portal and some guys we actually talked about during the draft process as well in the fall. And we'll hit on some old Bill Belichick news right after this.
If you love football, this is the best time of the year.
This is as big as it gets.
The stuff of absolute dreams.
All right, Coop, let's talk about some of these transfer portal non-QBs. We don't have to spend a lot of time on them, but I just want to touch on them. I'm going to start with Princewell Umanmielen, whose name sticks out because his brother, Princely, I think, right? Is Princely?
Princely.
Yeah, yep. Princely, who's at Ole Miss by way of Florida. Umanmielen is he's going to get drafted. He's going to get drafted pretty high. I think he's accepted his Senior Bowl invite, and we've talked about him on the podcast previously. I think his younger brother, Princewell, might be a little bit taller. Prince Lee at Ole Miss, a little twitchier for me, but his brother's going to follow in his footsteps, and he's leaving Nebraska. And I've been watching a little bit of Nebraska defense because they have some dudes on that front four that are going to get drafted. Is this a situation where money is the driving force, or is the connection with his brother? Because it feels like Nebraska had something good going there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. The kid was a late riser for us coming out 2 years ago. We snuck him into the back end in the top 247. little bit of a wild card. His brother is a little bit of a wild card. Princely Mamiel, a guy that I always thought was going to, play with his hand in the ground, and he's standing up at Ole Miss. Big, thick kid. But yeah, I think it was, you look at Prince Will. This one was hard for me because I love the tape, and you pop on the tape against Colorado, you're like, whoa. And then the other part, it doesn't marry up. He's got a sack and a half over the last 2 years.
Right.
So you're trying to convince people like, hey, listen, this guy impacts the game. But in terms of what you see in the stat box, he wasn't filling it up. Yeah, but this is an interesting guy from the standpoint that I think there were some football character questions in Nebraska. His snaps got cut in half from his freshman to his sophomore year.
Gotcha.
Pretty similar to his brother, right? Coming out of Florida as well. There are a lot of question marks about him coming out of Gainesville, and then he goes to Ole Miss, and it seems like Ole Miss these guys are right up their alley. They're able to get them right, get them honed in on football, and get the best out of these guys, which I think is important. But with Prince Will, I want to be careful with my words here, but you watch the way that this guy's used. I mean, he's used as a second level defender. They use him primarily off the edge as a pass rusher. He can drop in coverage. It's like a longer version of Harold Perkins in terms of the positional usage. Quick twitch, explosive, can win with speed and athleticism, but can also win with power. And I thought the motor ran hot. I mean, there was maybe a couple snaps against Illinois where I was like, all right, I want a little bit more. He's just got some natural stuff. I went back, watched him this morning. He's been the one that's kind of been keeping me up at night because it's, when you do this job, it's kind of like, am I on an island here? Am I seeing this the right way? In reality, I think he's got top 40 upside. And we have a round 3 grade on him. So I've been pretty conservative with him, but I love the kid. And I just think he's going to take off in Oxford.
I don't know how much of Princely you watch, but do you think Princely's a better player right now, right? Would you agree with that?
I haven't watched too much of Princely.
Okay.
Yeah, but Princely in terms of what I believe, I could be wrong. I believe he's a shoe-in for a day 2 pick.
Yeah. Nope. I'm with you on that 100%. All right. I didn't know who Eric Rivers was at FIU, but I saw his name in the transfer portal. And where's he headed?
Did you watch these guys?
Huh?
Have you gotten to watch any of these guys?
I went back and watched. I watched the guys on this list. I did just to get a sense of who they were. But I don't think Eric Rivers has committed yet. Am I correct on that?
Correct.
No,
we
hasn't.
actually had him. We had him on the show yesterday. He was, ironically enough, he was in Omaha.
Okay. Here, let me set this up real
Nebraska.
quick. So he's scheduled to visit Miami of Florida, Nebraska, Penn State, and Colorado. I did write that down. And 5'11" is what he's listed at, about 175. I got some Calvin Austin vibes watching him. They line him up outside. He is electric. He's a track guy. He had a game against New Mexico where he went for 295 and 3 touchdowns. He high jumped 6'4", which is, I don't know much about track and field, but when you're 5'11",
No,
and you're high jumping
that's
6'4",
insane for his size.
that's bonkers. Ran the 111.4. So anyway, go ahead. I just want to get that out there because he was running by guys all day long, and even though he played a lot of outside too.
Well, that's the thing, right? We were interviewing him yesterday, and I'm looking at his positional breakdown. It's got 650 snaps on the outside. He's got 61 out of the slot, and I'm like, is it just FIU? Like, what's the deal here? But he also led the Conference USA in receiving. So naturally, I think this guy is a slot. I mean, I think that's what he is. But watching him, he's interesting. He's not a finished product. Strong run after catch receiver. I think the hands leave a little bit to be desired. He's not the most natural pass catcher. Can get vertical. He's a dynamic dude, man. And I think they probably left some food on the table, not playing him on the inside, right? Which I think wherever he goes next, he's going to be a really natural slot wide receiver. I'm a big fan of this kid. He needs a little bit of polish, but just in terms of like the raw traits, man, super, super dynamic.
Absolutely. And he'll block his ass off too for 175, which gets your attention. And I think you heard me, Devo. Penn State could use Eric Rivers right now. Like that's how fun this kid was to watch. He started at Memphis, missed 22 with an injury. He's been at FIU since the 23 season. And I mentioned him because he's going to be draft eligible in a couple of years. No, next year. He'll be draft eligible next year. So that'll be a name to watch. Rick and I talked about Kentucky's Dane Key and Berrien Brown. Dane Key looks like he might be headed to Ole Miss. I saw that Georgia, according to the reports I read, you would know better than me, we're looking to upgrade the receiver position as well. 6'3", 195. And then Berrien Brown headed to LSU. Kyron Lacey is one of my favorite players in this draft class, by the way. So Kyron will be gone. Berrien Brown could be a target for a guy, Nussbus. But two guys that are obviously going to be huge losses at Kentucky. In terms of comps, I said Jalen McMillan, sort of the Dane Key vibes. He's a little bigger. Berrien Brown reminded me a little bit of Emmanuel Sanders, but those are just sort of general fall time comps. Those may change, but they're both going back to school. So your thoughts on maybe those guys and what they bring to perhaps Ole Miss or Georgia, and then of course Berrien Brown at LSU.
Yeah, Dane Key, I believe, was could be wrong here, but multi-sport guy coming out. Always played above the rim. I think I was like, all right, this guy outside the numbers, linear in terms of what he could do. You turn in the tape, which is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of the show. What I love is like, all right, you get to see where these guys are at, and you're like, man, this guy's got a little bit more lateral juice than I thought. He's a long strider, but he is a supernatural pass catcher. And his combination of suddenness, route tempo, his ability to attack leverage, I love, and he knows how to use that frame. I think the other thing, production standpoint, I mean, you look at Kentucky and you're like, man, you got Dane Key, you got Berrien Brown, and you go out and you get Brock Vandegrift, you get Devin Leary. Like, what are we doing?
That's as angry as I've ever seen you, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, dude, look at these guys. You got a window here, right? Feed these dudes, man. And Dane Key was uber productive, even despite that. So I think with a more steady quarterback situation, Dane Key is going to be one of those guys that emerges. It was funny stacking these guys because I thought Key was cleaner. I thought Berrien had the higher upside. And Berrien, just from a playmaking standpoint, is a super dynamic guy. Now, the thing with him, the hands are inconsistent, and I've thought that, and I think he's more of you'd like him to be a number two. I think speed and athleticism says he can be that. But in terms of the dependability in the hands, I think he's more of a vertical threat. I love him in the return game. Kentucky did a good job getting him involved at and behind the line of scrimmage. Could make you miss. And quite honestly, he's not as polished up as Kyron Lacey, but just raw movement ability. Some similarities there. I think Berrien Brown's more explosive from a verticality standpoint. Lacey a little bit more fine-tuned as a route runner. Cortez Hankton's one of the best in the business, man, the receivers coach at LSU. So I like this fit because I think this is one of those moves for the player that, like, hey, I got 1 year to kind of get it right and take my game to the next level. He's going to go work with one of the best in the business.
And he's going to see plenty of targets. It's funny you mentioned that. So Brown's also a returner. He would kick and punt return all 3 seasons in Kentucky. And I was looking at sort of the fall grades I had. I had Berrien Brown as a day 2 guy, and I had Dane as a early day 3 guy. And for the reasons that you're talking about here, a little more juice with Berrien Brown. And he's not 6'3". He's listed as 6'1", so he could be 5'11", 6 feet for all we know. But I agree with what you said there. So interesting. And finally, cornerback Julian Humphrey. He got benched midway through the Georgia season. He's a big, long corner. Looked a little stiff at times to me, but I didn't watch every single rep of his. But anyway, he's out of Georgia and he's headed to Texas A&M. What were your thoughts of Julian sort of coming out of high school, if you had any? And
elite tester. I mean, this is a guy with a 40+ inch vert, ran low 4.4s.
All right.
He's going to blow people's minds at the NFL Combine.
Right.
But you said it. Here's the thing. He started throughout the season. He gets benched, and then he's out before the SEC championship, right? So that's going to get earmarked. People are going to ask him about it at the Combine. Then they're going to see him test, and they're going to forget all about it. The other thing is the instincts, and that really kind of shows up. I think this is a guy, when he's playing off ball, he's a little bit lost in space. When you put him man-to-man, bump and run, press man, it's like just let the athleticism and the length take over along with everything else, right? But he really struggles to find the ball in the air, and I think that's been an issue when he's going up against elite competition in the SEC. You think about some of these guys that he's faced, Isaiah Bond coming to mind as well.
Mhm.
Those are guys that, have had some productive days. So traits all there, in terms of getting the best out of him. Like now he's going to go to Texas A&M. He's going to play opposite another freak in Desmond Ricks, who was a former 5-star that transferred from Alabama. And now you're looking at
Is that related
A&M
to Eli?
secondary. I don't think they're related.
Okay.
But from a physical stature standpoint, yes, they could be. But yeah, Humphrey's one of those guys is like, 5th round grade. And a lot of that has to do, it's like what I'm learning, stacking the portal. It's like there are a lot of guys with a lot of ability that I'd love to go higher on. But they're on their 2nd, 3rd, 4th school, or they have medical, or they have football character questions.
Right.
And ultimately, at the end of the day, I want the guys that are going to be available, dependable, and are going to have an impact, And I'm sure some of these guys are going to go on to get drafted and stick around in the league and that type of stuff. But Humphrey's one of those guys. You question it a little bit, and I get it. It's the modern day of college football, and this is what it is, and people probably aren't looking at it the same. But I think was a guy that was leaning out last year at some point. They were able to find a solution, get him back. We saw this with Bear Alexander. I think he went back to the negotiating table, asked for more money, and went to USC, and Georgia said, "Okay, fine, go."
Yeah.
And look how that's worked out for him, right? So maybe that works out for Julian Humphrey, but I'm just kind of interested to see what that looks like.
Yeah, it's crazy because when you talk about the physical gifts these kids have that very few people on planet Earth have, and then I don't want to say wasted, but it feels like they're not being utilized to their fullest extent, and that can be frustrating just on the outside looking in. But
I mean, it's just I don't understand. Continuity can only be your greatest asset, and I get it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying like, hey, these guys a lot of these guys have gone other places and they've benefited. But there are a lot of situations you look at and you're just like, why? You're just starting to figure it out. This kid at South Carolina that transferred, the Bengley Kamara, is going to Kansas, and he was at Pitt before he transferred to South Carolina. And you see South Carolina starting to scale his reps, and he's starting to flash on tape. And it's like game 4 or 5, I'm out. It's like, what are you doing?
right.
Who's in
Right.
your ear telling you these things? I don't understand it. And they end up losing out in the short term and the long term as well.
Yep.
So
It's funny you mention that because that's a nice transition to Bill Belichick. We do this segment every week called Over Rick Actions, where Devo and I come up with some questions for Rick and don't tell him what they are, usually from the previous NFL weekend, and get his thoughts. And, it usually ends up with me joking, if you're sitting in the GM suite, are you throwing the veggie tray or not after this transpires on the field? And it usually ends up with him throwing the veggie tray. But in terms of Bill Belichick, number one, incredibly shocking that he's going to UNC. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise. Don Shula's record and so on and so forth. But I asked Rick this last week if he thought Bill Belichick was going to have success, because he knows Nick Saban. He's worked closely with Nick Saban. They were together in Miami. Nick Saban fired him as GM back in 2000 or whenever that was. And, he and Nick have worked together in recent years at Alabama. And I said, look, here's the thing. And Rick, you know better than me, but here's the thing with Nick Saban. He can relate to these kids in a way that a lot of people can't. And that seems to be an avenue for getting the most out of them. And he's been doing it for a long time. Bill Belichick feels like more of a my way or the highway guy. And to your most recent point about players, especially 17, 18, 19-year-olds, having a vision of what their career should look like as opposed to what reality suggests it should look like, is Bill Belichick going to be able to be successful in the ACC at UNC, a program that was terrible this year, but they've had some moderate success, I suppose you could say. And how's this recruiting thing going to work for a 72, almost 73-year-old who's never, ever, ever had to do it?
I actually think it sets up for him quite nice.
All right, let's hear it.
Yeah, here's my take. I think UNC is one of, if not the sneakiest job in college football, one of the most appealing. I've always had my eyes on UNC. I love that job from a geographical standpoint, what the brand represents. We've seen it on the basketball side, obviously with Jordan as well. It's interesting hearing Michael Lombardi, former GM of the Browns, obviously worked with Belichick very closely, now the GM in North Carolina, kind of talk about their vision for UNC and kind of what that represents.
Michael
and what
Lombardi
it
is the
looks
GM
like.
in UNC now?
Michael Lombardi is the general manager at UNC.
I didn't know that.
That kind of
Maybe he's
changes
going to take
things a
Rick with
little
him
bit,
because they're
right?
33rd team, right?
Right.
That's the same Michael
So
Lombardi.
it's fascinating from that standpoint.
Interesting.
But you look at UNC and you look at, all right, if I were to tell you the recruiting rankings this year in the ACC, what would you have said they finished? Who were the top 4 teams?
Clemson. I want to say Florida State, but Florida State stinks. Miami. Who else is in there? You saw me on Louisville and Duke. How about that?
Miami, Georgia Tech, Florida State, Clemson in that order. Clemson was outside the top 25. First time under Dabo Swinney, I believe, that they were outside of the top 25. So
nice.
You look at the ACC from a high school standpoint, you're kind of sitting there saying, all right, who's the dominant force in the Tidewater area? Yeah, South Carolina's doing some nice things, but have they planted the flag so much that UNC can't make inroads? No. Clemson.
Jesus, UNC 17th, by the way, as Debo scrolls through the rankings.
And that typically happens when you have a coaching change, right? So that's part of it. And that's why Mac Brown is not there anymore. But UNC back in 2022 under Mac Brown, they're ranked number 11. Now the game has changed a lot since then. But you look at Colorado. I was one of the biggest skeptics just in terms of I just didn't know. I didn't know. We'd never seen it. Deion Sanders took 95 transfers in his first 2 years. 95. Okay, think about that.
People were mad about it.
Scorched earth, burned that roster to the ground, flipped it over, and sure, he's going to have 2 top 10 picks, right, and a Heisman Trophy winner. That goes a long way. But this team had 1 win before he got there in the Big 12, which I think is pretty similar to the ACC, just in terms of how you view the teams. First year, 4 wins. Second year, 9 wins with a chance to get to 10 in the postseason. And you got to give a ton of credit to Deion Sanders and the job that he's done. And he made some moves that he took a lot of heat for. He put Pat Shurmur as his OC, moving on quickly from his first year OC. And then Livingston he took from the NFL, and they were able to upgrade that unit big time. Now you look at Belichick, and, I'm hearing him talk on Pat McAfee's show yesterday, and he's like, it's not that different. It's not as different as I thought it was. And that was kind of my thing. Like, collegiately, I think these guys look at it, Belichick and Lombardi, and they're saying, all right, revenue shares coming in this year. This is going to be more and more black and white as the game continues to evolve. Every year this goes, it becomes more and more and more transactional. It becomes about a finite number of money, and can you get me to the league? And if that's the case, these guys actually have more exposure to that than anybody else in the college game does.
Right.
They've lived there. They've lived under a CBA. I'm not saying that's where the college game is going, but they understand the pieces of roster building and how much to financially invest in each position. The scouting part, I think these guys are going to adapt very quickly. I think they're going to have to, I always talk about, when you go from when I was at Cincinnati and I went to Michigan, people always ask me, all right, what was that transition like? Well, there is a period of time you have to elevate your eyes. What was the standard at Cincinnati, a group of 5 school at the time? It's not the same standard at Michigan, one of the best programs in the country. I think for Belichick and Lombardi, it's going to be like, all right, what's a winnable player in college that is maybe a PFA guy and, we can win with in the ACC as we're starting to build this thing up long-term to have it kind of look the way that we want it to look like.
You know what? Now that you mentioned that, I don't know if there's been a coach that's gotten more out of PFAs at the NFL level than Bill Belichick, right? So that actually tracks. That's a great point.
So here's the other thing. They got their first transfer commit yesterday. And it's this center who's like 6'2" and change from Holy Cross. And I could not
that's
wait
the most
to
Belichick
dig into
pick
the
ever.
tape. And I'm watching this kid versus Syracuse, and I'm like, whew. I'm looking, all of a sudden, I'm like looking at our interior line board. I'm like, damn, am I going to love it? And where do I have him? I'm like, this guy's probably like in it, tier 1 priority free agent. And it looked like one of those guys that everybody else just kind of discounts. New England would pick up, and then all of a sudden that guy's there. He's a 7 or 8 year vet in the league, and that first guy is indicative kind of who they are and who they want to be. And I can see every team looking at that guy and saying, we want a little bit bigger. We want a little bit longer. We want a little bit more proven. And it probably the same thing that happened in the NFL. And then you get to college and Belichick's looking at him and say, oh yeah, I'll take him.
It's funny.
So it's going to be fun, man.
Do you remember Ted Karras, center out of Illinois, interior offensive lineman? He's been in the league for over a decade now. I talked to him at one of the Super Bowls 6-7 years ago when he was with the Patriots, and I was asking about his draft process, and he said, "You know what? I had my pro day, and I think he said one team showed up. It was the Patriots. Legendary coach Dante Scarnecchia showed up, worked me out. They liked me. He was undersized, wasn't a great athlete. They drafted him on day 3 at some point, and he's been playing for 10 years. He's playing with the Bengals now, and he's like, yeah, they were the only team that showed interest. I didn't ask why. He may have had short arms, whatever. But there's a type, right? You talk about your buddy having a type. Belichick has a type, and it's usually the lunch pail guy, as we like to call him.
No, I mean, it's I'm watching this guy. I'm like, okay, and it's I mean, I'm cracking up laughing because it's the first guy that they sign, and I think, I don't want to say exploit, but I think they're going to do a really, really good job kind of in that gray area where everybody's up here and they're floating with the top targets. And, obviously they need talent just like everybody else does. But there's a level of conviction and credibility that they bring to the operation where I think, when I used to work on it, I think the thing that can hurt you the most in the evaluation process, in the portal process, is hesitation. Just not having confidence in your process. And, because you start to meddle a little bit and you say, well, there's low hanging fruit over here. Maybe we want to go this way. Or, hey, you know what? I don't know. Keep them on the back burner versus, Belichick, Lombardi, the synergy. Obviously, they've been doing this for a long time. They know who they are.
Right.
And the best teams in the portal know who they are. They're established. Oregon is one of the best. Ole Miss is one of the best. LSU right now is having a great cycle because these guys have done the work. They're prepared. They know what they need, and they're convicted, and they got the money right. It's all allocated. So it's been, I'll tell you what, man, it's been such a blast just watching these teams. Texas Tech has been phenomenal in the portal. They go out, they get this FCS All-American safety who's banged up a little bit this year from North Dakota State, Wisniewski. They grabbed a couple guys, grab a corner out of Mississippi State, a receiver out of Miami, Ohio. And I think people always wonder, like, oh, where'd this team come from? But this is like what's happening right now is like the next frontier of college football. And I don't think people really get it. But it's so important, because next year you might look up and you're like, Texas Tech, what the hell?
Yeah, I will be doing that.
But if you're following this, you can see it, but it's so untapped. So I love following it because you can get a sense kind of what teams are trying to do, who they're trying to be. Maybe we could have seen Georgia Tech coming right before they had the year that they had, right? So Syracuse as well, right? So
shout out Fran Brown. Man.
Shout out Fran Brown. Doing a hell of a job.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I live in Syracuse, so I've been a couple games, and the energy that man coaches, let alone sort of recruits and does the other thing. He's been fun, and it's been fun for the town who's needed something uplifting, at least with the football program. One quick thing on Belichick, and then we'll get out of here. Maybe two, because I always have a ton of questions for you. As you're talking, like, I'm sold. Like, I was skeptical until the last 15 minutes, and it feels like almost I don't want to oversell it, but like sort of a Billy Bean Moneyball situation where they found the market deficiencies and they found their sort of Kevin Youkilis Greek god of walks in the form of this center, for example, at a Holy Cross. But they're going to find these guys that maybe are undervalued because of size or speed or whatever and get the most out of them because their advantage is being able to coach these kids up, and they have obviously the resume to do it. Is there any concern that this could be going back to Belichick's personality and, his players love him or hate him? He's not, Tom Brady jokes all the time that he's not the fuzziest, warmest guy. And maybe he doesn't need to be, but is there any concern that when you're dealing with 17, 18, 19-year-olds, it could be a one and done situation where once you get 1 year out of them, maybe they go into the portal? Or is that not, you just keep bringing it, you just keep the sort of conveyor belt going?
I mean, I think everybody's dealing with it. I think the biggest thing that has stuck out to me this entire week or so since Belichick has been hired, I was at an all-star game, high school all-star game down in Mobile, and I asked one of the players who's going to Texas A&M. I said, "Hey, what are your thoughts on Bill Belichick going to North Carolina?" And he said, "Who?"
I was going to ask you, did he know who he was?
And, you think about it, when Bill Belichick won his last Super Bowl, these guys enrolling in school were 12 years old.
Crazy.
So the other part of this is like, I think North Carolina needs to be extremely self-aware about the fact that the PR, the marketing machine, they have work to do. It's not prime time Deion Sanders. It's, when Deion got hired, Deion was like one of the best things about him. I mean, he was just a walking marketing machine. This guy had a show on Prime. He had a son that was extremely popular on socials. Belichick, where it's like, yeah, he's got credibility with you and me. He's got credibility, cachet within the personnel community and the coaching community and the adults that have watched him and watched Brady and those teams. But to the teenagers, there's still a bridge to gap. The other part of this is like in terms of getting to these guys, I actually think Belichick is aware of what needs to be done. And does that mean he's going to change? No, I don't think he should change. But I also think he's acutely aware of the fact that he's not coaching Tom Brady.
Right.
He's coaching 17-year-old freshman Bryce Baker. And it's a different type of relationship that you're going to have with that type of player. I just watching those two kind of interact and, the way he said is like, even him saying, it's great to have Bryce here. And it's like, I know he's not used to that. That's probably him doing a little bit more than he's ever done in the past. But that's a little incremental step of him playing the game. So I think the fact that he's, willing, and maybe I'm stretching it a little bit, but I think the fact that he's shown that he's been willing to do that, and I think, North Carolina can like cover him up. There's some coaches out there, I won't name names. There's some high level coaches. These cats don't recruit, man.
Okay.
And I'll tell you this, but their operation moves on because now they're in a game where it's like, hey, we love you. We'll get you on the field. We'll develop you. You'll play at the highest level. And we have the most competitive offer at the end of the day. The other stuff is kind of like, it's out the window. That traditional recruitment stuff. I always talk about it. You got to win the traditional recruitment, and then you have to win the NIL recruitment. And the traditional recruitment has just become less and less important. Now think of it as like a top 30 visit, where I got 3 teams that I'm going to visit, and I'm Jesse Bates, and I'm a safety, and I'm going to the Falcons, I'm going to the Saints, and I got a 1 year. I'm a 1 year contract, and who's going to get me to my next stop?
Because this is less about taking care of my baby and more about, as you mentioned, transactional. We're looking to get paid because this is a job.
And the more transactional the college game becomes, the more beneficial it is for Bill Belichick. And it's never been more transactional than it is right now.
Once again, he's outfoxed the fox. He knows what he's doing. Golly. Because I was like, I don't know. Because I grew up in North Carolina. I'm a UNC fan. Care more about basketball than football. But I was like, all right, he's going to go there. This feels like a pit stop for him, maybe to try to get his foot back in the door. But you sold me.
Can I make one more point?
Yeah, of course.
Regardless of how this experiment works out on the field, I think him hiring Lombardi, and Lombardi, we'll see what happens. But if Lombardi decides to build a front office and emulate everything he's done in the NFL, it's going to change the game of college football forever.
Oh.
And in a better way. I think from an infrastructure standpoint, the game has been slowly gravitating. Oh, they're general managers and they do this. Oh, there's director of college scouting. There's been little parts of it where the game has slowly gravitated towards what they're doing in the NFL. I think Lombardi's going to come in and just be like, this is what we had on Sundays, and I'm going to build it on Saturdays. And the way that it works in the college game is everybody sees that and they say, well, okay, hold on. If Belichick's doing it, we got to do it. And that's what happened with Saban at Alabama. He built the first recruiting department. And after that, you saw schools building and trying to emulate, and they had no idea what they're doing. But they knew Alabama had it, so they had to build some version of that. So like I said, I don't know what it's going to look like on the field, but these guys, their presence alone, I believe if they do what I think they're going to do, is going to advance the sport in a major way from a personnel standpoint, which I'm extremely, extremely excited about.
I love it. I'm glad we had you on, Coop, just only for the last 15 minutes of the Belichick topic, because I learned a ton there. I appreciate you as always. But before I let you go, we have a little dollar bet thing we do here. I'm going to put you on the spot, dollar bet wise. And if you lose, you can give the dollar to Rick because he's going to need it. 9 wins in 2025 for UNC. Over or under?
I'm going to go under.
Oh,
I'm going to go 8.
Okay.
Looking at their schedule, it's pretty. Their schedule is pretty manageable. There's some questions though, like I don't, what are they going to do at quarterback?
Yeah.
Still haven't hired the coordinators yet. I don't know. They got some work to do in the portal.
Oh, we know who the defensive coordinator is going to be.
That's right. Coach in waiting.
He's currently at Washington. Yeah, the coach in waiting currently at Washington.
Right.
That's all speculation.
So we'll see. I'll go with 8 though. I think that's a nice number.
All right. That's a huge upgrade from where they are as they currently sit here. Coop, I appreciate you, man. That was great having you on.
Man.
Rick was afraid he was going to get Wally pipped. I don't know if you know who Wally Pipp is. You're a youngster too, so maybe that's your Bill Belichick.
Hey, Rick, if you're listening, I do know who Wally Pipp is, and you should be afraid.
I love it. All right. We'll see you guys later in the week. Thanks, Coop. Good talking to you, buddy.
Thank you.